You woke up this morning in a different reality than the one you fell asleep in. Not dramatically different. Not obviously different. But different nonetheless. The version of you watching this video right now exists in a timeline that branched off from infinite other possibilities the moment you made your first decision today. Whether to get out of bed or hit snooze. Whether to speak or stay silent. Whether to act on an impulse or ignore it. Each choice, no matter how small, split reality. And in each split, a different version of you continued down a different path. This isn't philosophy. This is quantum mechanics applied to consciousness. And it's happening whether you're aware of it or not. Quantum jumping, the phenomenon of shifting from one reality to another, has been relegated to the realm of fantasy by those who don't understand how fluid reality actually is. They imagine it requires elaborate rituals, specialized knowledge, or some kind of supernatural gift. But the truth is far more mundane and far more profound. You're already doing it. Every single day. Every single moment. The only difference between someone who jumps consciously and someone who jumps unconsciously is awareness. And once awareness enters the equation, once you realize the mechanism has always been running in the background, you can finally take the wheel. Think of reality as a vast library. Infinite books on infinite shelves. Each book represents a different version of your life, a different timeline, a different outcome. Right now, you're reading one specific book, but all the others exist simultaneously, waiting on their respective shelves. Every choice you make is you closing one book and opening another. Most people believe they're stuck in the book they started with, as if reality is linear, as if the story was written before they arrived. But quantum physics has shattered that illusion. At the subatomic level, particles don't exist in one place. They exist in multiple places simultaneously until observed. And when observed, they collapse into a single location. Your consciousness is the observer, and reality is the particle. This explains why two people can experience the same event completely differently. They're not in the same reality. They're in overlapping realities, close enough to interact but different enough that their experiences don't match. One person walks away from a conversation feeling inspired. The other walks away feeling dismissed. Same words were spoken. Different realities were experienced. And both are valid because both exist. The question is not which reality is true. The question is which reality are you currently occupying, and do you want to stay there? You've been jumping your entire life without realizing it. That moment when you almost took a different job but didn't. That split-second decision to cross the street at a different time. That conversation you had with a stranger that changed your perspective. Each of those moments was a jump, a branch point, a divergence in the timeline. And in another version of reality, you made the opposite choice. That other you is living a different life. Not in some distant dimension, but right here, woven into the same fabric of existence, separated only by frequency. Frequency is the key. Different realities vibrate at different frequencies. When you're in a state of fear, you're tuned to a specific channel. When you're in a state of love, you're tuned to a different one. The stations don't disappear when you change the channel. They continue broadcasting. You just can't hear them unless you're tuned in. And most people spend their lives locked onto the same few stations, wondering why their experience never changes. They're not stuck. They're just not turning the dial. The unconscious jumps you make every day are driven by your default state. Your habitual thoughts. Your recurring emotions. Your baseline beliefs about who you are and what's possible. If your default state is anxiety, you'll unconsciously jump to realities that validate anxiety. If your default state is trust, you'll land in realities that reflect trust. This is why some people seem to stumble into good fortune repeatedly while others attract disaster. It's not luck. It's frequency. And frequency determines which version of reality you collapse into with every passing moment. But here's where it gets interesting. Once you understand that you're already jumping, once you realize the mechanism is always active, you can begin to jump consciously. You can choose the direction. You can select the frequency. You can stop being a passive passenger in the library and start being the one who walks directly to the shelf you want. And when you do that, when you shift from unconscious to conscious jumping, reality stops feeling like something that happens to you and starts feeling like something you navigate. Not with force, not with control, but with intention, with clarity, with the quiet power of knowing that every moment is a doorway, and you get to decide which one you walk through. The reason quantum jumping sounds like science fiction is because most people were taught a version of physics that's outdated by nearly a century. The classical Newtonian view, the one where objects are solid, reality is fixed, and cause and effect is linear, still dominates everyday thinking. But quantum mechanics dismantled that worldview decades ago. And while the implications have been explored in laboratories, they've rarely been translated into practical understanding for how consciousness interacts with reality. Yet the science is there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for anyone curious enough to look beyond the surface. At the quantum level, particles exist in what's called a superposition. They're in multiple states at once until a measurement collapses them into one. Schrödinger's cat, the famous thought experiment, illustrates this. The cat in the box is both alive and dead simultaneously until you open the box and observe. The act of observation forces reality to choose. But here's what most people miss. You are the observer, and your life is the box. Every moment you're not consciously choosing, you're allowing the superposition to collapse randomly based on whatever frequency you're unconsciously broadcasting. The double-slit experiment confirmed that particles behave differently when observed versus when left alone. When unobserved, electrons behave like waves, passing through both slits simultaneously and creating an interference pattern. When observed, they behave like particles, choosing one slit or the other. This means observation itself alters reality. Not metaphorically, literally. And if observation at the particle level changes outcomes, how much more does observation at the level of human experience change the reality you live in? But it goes deeper. Quantum entanglement shows that particles once connected remain connected regardless of distance. Change the state of one, and the other changes instantly, faster than light could travel between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. But it's been proven again and again. And if particles can remain entangled across space, what does that say about consciousness? What does that say about the way your thoughts, emotions, and intentions entangle with the field of possibility around you? You're not separate from reality. You're woven into it. And every shift in your internal state sends ripples through the field. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics takes this further. It suggests that every possible outcome of every decision actually happens. Not in alternate dimensions far away, but in branching realities that coexist. When you make a choice, the timeline splits. One version of you goes left. Another version goes right. Both are real. Both continue. And while you experience only one path consciously, the other versions of you are living out the other possibilities. This isn't theoretical anymore. It's mathematically consistent. And it explains why déjà vu feels so visceral. You're not remembering the future. You're brushing up against a timeline where that moment already happened. Now apply this to your life. Every decision point is a branch. Every emotion is a frequency selector. Every belief is a filter determining which branch you collapse into. If you believe success is hard, you'll consistently find yourself in timelines where success requires struggle. Not because struggle is objectively necessary, but because your belief tunes you to that frequency. Another version of you, in another timeline, made a different assumption. And their success came easily. Same person. Different belief. Different reality. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that you cannot simultaneously know both the position and momentum of a particle with absolute precision. The more you know about one, the less you know about the other. Translated to life, this means the more rigid you are about how things should unfold, the less you can perceive the momentum carrying you toward something better. Control and flow are inversely related. The more you grip, the less you glide. And quantum jumping requires glide. It requires the willingness to not know exactly how, only to trust that the shift is happening. The science also points to the observer effect in a broader sense. Your expectations shape what you see. If you expect hostility, you'll notice every slight, every frown, every moment that confirms hostility. If you expect kindness, you'll notice every smile, every gesture, every moment that confirms kindness. Same environment, different observer, different reality. This is not selective perception in the psychological sense alone. It's quantum selection. You're collapsing the wave function of your experience based on what you're tuned to observe. Zero-point energy, the idea that even in a vacuum, energy fluctuates and particles pop in and out of existence, suggests that reality is not empty space filled with objects. It's a field of potential constantly manifesting and dissolving. You're not moving through a static world. You're moving through a field that's generating reality moment by moment. And your consciousness is not separate from that field. It's part of the generating mechanism. When you shift your state, you're not changing your perception of a fixed reality. You're changing which version of reality manifests around you. This is why the science of quantum mechanics, when truly understood, is not cold or deterministic. It's liberating. It reveals that reality is participatory. That consciousness is not a passive witness but an active creator. And that every moment, you're either unconsciously collapsing into the default timeline your past has conditioned you for, or you're consciously jumping to a new one. The mechanism is always on. The field is always responsive. The only question is whether you're aware enough to use it intentionally. You've jumped more times than you can count, but most of those shifts went unrecognized because you weren't looking for them. Quantum jumps don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they're subtle. A slight change in how a familiar place feels. A conversation that takes an unexpected turn. A sudden clarity that wasn't there yesterday. These aren't coincidences. They're evidence. Evidence that you've shifted from one timeline to another, and the reality you're now navigating is not the one you were in before. One of the clearest signs of a jump is the Mandela effect, the phenomenon where large groups of people remember something differently than it currently exists. Some remember a movie quote one way, only to find it was never said that way. Some recall a logo looking different than it does now. Skeptics dismiss this as faulty memory. But what if it's not? What if those people genuinely experienced a timeline where the quote was different, the logo was different, and then jumped to a timeline where it changed? Memory isn't the issue. Timeline convergence is. Another sign is the sudden disappearance or appearance of people in your life. Someone you were close to drifts away without conflict, without explanation, as if the connection simply dissolved. Or someone new enters your life at precisely the right moment, as if they were always meant to be there. These aren't accidents. When you jump timelines, the cast of characters shifts. Not everyone in your old reality is meant to be in your new one. And not everyone in your new reality existed in your old one. The people around you are reflections of the frequency you're holding. Change the frequency, change the faces. You've also likely experienced moments where time felt distorted. An hour passed in what felt like minutes. Or minutes dragged on like hours. Time is not as fixed as you've been taught. It's relative. And when you jump timelines, the experience of time shifts as well. In some realities, you have all the time you need. In others, you're constantly racing the clock. The difference isn't external. It's internal. Your relationship with time determines which timeline you occupy. And when you release the belief that time is scarce, you often find yourself in realities where it expands. Another indicator is the sudden resolution of a problem that felt insurmountable. You've been struggling with something for months, maybe years. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a solution appears. A person, a resource, an idea. And you wonder why it didn't show up sooner. It did show up sooner. Just not in the timeline you were occupying. But when you shifted, when your internal state changed enough to match a different frequency, you jumped into the timeline where the solution was already waiting. Synchronicities are also evidence of jumps. When you think of someone and they call. When you need something and it appears. When a book falls off a shelf and contains the exact message you needed. These aren't random. They're markers. Signs that you've aligned with a timeline where the universe is cooperating instead of resisting. Synchronicities don't happen to everyone equally. They happen to those who are consciously or unconsciously tuned to the frequency where reality is fluid and responsive. Dreams can also signal jumps. Not all dreams are symbolic. Some are glimpses into parallel timelines. You wake up from a dream that felt more real than waking life, with details so vivid you swear you lived them. Maybe you did. Maybe in another timeline, that dream is your reality. And in sleeping, your consciousness briefly merged with that version of you, downloading information, perspective, or simply reminding you that other possibilities exist. Physical sensations can accompany jumps as well. A sudden wave of dizziness. A brief moment of disorientation. A feeling like you've forgotten something but can't remember what. These are recalibration moments. Your consciousness adjusting to the new frequency. Your body catching up to the shift. Most people dismiss these as fatigue or stress. But they're often the body's response to occupying a slightly different vibration than it did moments before. You've also jumped when your preferences inexplicably change. Foods you once loved suddenly don't appeal. Music that used to move you leaves you cold. People you admired no longer resonate. This isn't you changing. This is you occupying a timeline where a different version of you has different tastes. And as you stabilize in that timeline, those preferences become your new normal. What you thought was personal growth was actually a quantum shift. Finally, there's the feeling of déjà vu, but in reverse. A sense that something should have happened but didn't. A memory of an event that never occurred in this timeline. You swear you had a conversation with someone, but they have no recollection. You remember a news story, but no one else does. You're not losing your mind. You're remembering a timeline you jumped from. And the memories are bleeding through because the shift wasn't complete. Part of you still resonates with where you were. But you're no longer there. And the dissonance you feel is your consciousness adjusting to the new coordinates. Once you understand that jumping is constant, the next step is learning to steer. Because unconscious jumping is like sailing without a rudder. You move, yes, but you go wherever the current takes you. And the current, if left unguided, will carry you toward the familiar. Toward the default. Toward the timeline that matches your conditioning, not your potential. Conscious jumping is about taking hold of the rudder. It's about choosing the destination before the wind decides for you. And it starts with understanding that the jump happens internally before it manifests externally. The first requirement is clarity. You cannot jump to a reality you haven't defined. Most people live in vague desire. They want to be happy, or successful, or free, but they've never clarified what those words actually mean. And vague intentions produce vague results. If you want to jump consciously, you must know where you're jumping to. Not every detail. Not every step. but the frequency, the feeling, the essence of the reality you're selecting. Close your eyes and ask, what does life feel like in the timeline I want to occupy? Not what does it look like? What does it feel like? Because feeling is frequency. And frequency is the coordinate system of quantum reality. The second requirement is embodiment. You don't jump by thinking about the new reality. You jump by becoming it now. This is where most people stumble. They say they want abundance but live in scarcity. They say they want love but guard their heart. They say they want freedom but cling to control. The jump doesn't happen when your external circumstances change. It happens when your internal state changes. And your internal state changes when you stop waiting for evidence and start embodying the truth before the proof arrives. Embodiment means you walk, talk, decide, and move as the version of you who already exists in that timeline. Not as pretending, as practicing. If the version of you in the desired timeline is confident, you practice confidence now. Not fake confidence. Real confidence, rooted in the knowledge that the timeline you're selecting already exists and you're simply tuning into it. If the version of you in that timeline is generous, you practice generosity now. Not because you have excess, but because generosity is the frequency of that reality. And by matching the frequency, you collapse into it. The third requirement is release. You cannot carry the old timeline into the new one. Grudges, regrets, victim narratives. These are anchors. And anchors keep you docked in the reality you're trying to leave. Conscious jumping requires letting go. Not forgetting. Not pretending the past didn't happen. But releasing the energetic charge around it. Forgiving not because others deserve it, but because you need the energetic bandwidth. Releasing not because the pain wasn't real, but because holding on to it keeps you vibrating at the frequency of the timeline where the pain occurred. Another tool for conscious jumping is the use of imagination with intention. Imagination is not fantasy. It's the bridge between realities. When you imagine something vividly, with emotion, with sensory detail, you're not creating fiction. You're tuning into a timeline where that experience already exists. And the more vividly you tune in, the more your consciousness begins to resonate with that frequency. This is why visualization works when done correctly. Not because you're manifesting something from nothing, but because you're aligning with a something that already is. Language also plays a role. The words you use shape the reality you occupy. When you say, "I'm trying to get healthy," you're affirming the trying, not the being. When you say, "I'm broke," you're collapsing into timelines that validate broke. But when you shift your language to reflect the timeline you're choosing, "I'm building wealth," "I'm healing," "I'm becoming," you're linguistically aligning with a different frequency. Words are spells. That's why it's called spelling. And every sentence you speak is either casting you deeper into your current reality or pulling you toward a new one. Conscious jumping also requires vigilance over your focus. Attention is the mechanism of collapse. Whatever you give sustained attention to, you empower. If you spend hours scrolling through news that amplifies fear, you're tuning into timelines where fear is dominant. If you spend your mental energy replaying past failures, you're collapsing into timelines where failure is your baseline. But when you guard your attention, when you deliberately focus on what reflects the reality you're choosing, you begin to stabilize in that timeline. Not overnight, but consistently. And consistency in frequency produces stability in reality. Finally, conscious jumping requires trust in the lag. The internal shift happens instantly. The external shift takes time to catch up. And in that gap, doubt will creep in. You'll look around and see the old reality still there, and you'll wonder if the jump worked. But the jump already happened. The moment you shifted internally, you moved. The external world is just catching up, like an echo bouncing back. And if you collapse back into doubt during the lag, you'll jump back to the old timeline. But if you hold the new frequency despite what you see, the external will eventually mirror it. This is the test. Not whether you can jump, but whether you can stay jumped long enough for the evidence to arrive. Once you've learned to jump consciously, once you've experienced the shift from one timeline to another and watched reality rearrange itself to match your internal frequency, you cross a threshold. You stop seeing yourself as a person living one life in one reality. You start seeing yourself as a consciousness navigating infinite possibilities, selecting and deselecting timelines with every choice, every thought, every emotion. And that recognition changes everything. Not because you become omnipotent, but because you become responsible. Responsible for the reality you occupy. Responsible for the timeline you select. Responsible for the frequency you broadcast. Living as a conscious navigator means you no longer blame circumstances. You understand that circumstances are reflections, not causes. When something shows up in your reality that you don't like, you don't ask, "Why is this happening to me?" You ask, "What frequency am I holding that's collapsing this outcome?" And if you're honest with the answer, you'll find that the reality you're experiencing matches the state you've been embodying. Not always perfectly, not always immediately, but consistently. And when you shift the state, the reality shifts with it. This doesn't mean you can jump into a timeline where all pain disappears. Pain is part of the human experience across all timelines. But you can jump into timelines where pain has meaning, where suffering leads to growth, where challenges are met with support instead of isolation. The goal is not to escape hardship. The goal is to navigate it from a timeline where you have the resources, internal and external, to move through it with grace. And that timeline already exists. You just have to match its frequency. Conscious navigation also means you become highly selective about what you allow into your field. People, media, environments, conversations, all of these carry frequency. And when you're around them, you're either being pulled toward their frequency or holding yours steady. If you're not careful, you'll spend so much energy resisting the frequencies around you that you'll have none left to hold the frequency of the timeline you want. So you cure it, not out of judgment, but out of preservation. You protect your frequency the way a musician protects their instrument. Because your frequency is the instrument through which reality is played. Living this way also means you stop being surprised by miracles. When something extraordinary happens, when a door opens that shouldn't have, when a solution appears out of nowhere, you don't call it luck. You recognize it as evidence of the timeline you've selected. And instead of marveling at it as if it's rare, you normalize it. You expect it. Not from entitlement, but from understanding. You know that in the timeline you're occupying, miracles are frequent because that's the nature of that reality. And the more you normalize them, the more they appear. You also develop the ability to course correct quickly. When you notice you've drifted into a timeline you don't want, when fear has pulled you off course or doubt has anchored you back in scarcity, you don't spiral. You pause. You breathe. You recalibrate. You ask, what frequency do I want to hold? And then you hold it. Not perfectly. Not without wobbling. But deliberately. And that deliberate return to the chosen frequency is what stabilizes you in the desired timeline. Another aspect of living as a navigator is humility. You realize that while you have agency, you're not the only consciousness navigating these timelines. Others are jumping too. And sometimes their jumps intersect with yours in ways you didn't plan. Someone exits your reality not because you did something wrong, but because their timeline diverged from yours. Someone enters your reality not because you manifested them, but because your frequencies aligned. This keeps you from inflating your role while also honoring your power. You're co-creating, not dictating. You also learn to read the signs more fluently. Synchronicities stop being surprising and start being language. A number sequence. a song on the radio, a phrase someone says. These are not random. They're feedback. The universe, or more accurately, the field of consciousness you're part of, is constantly communicating. And when you're tuned in, you hear it. You see it. You feel it. And you adjust accordingly. You're not moving blindly. You're moving in conversation with the intelligence that underlies all realities. Living as a conscious navigator means you also become less attached to outcomes. You know that the timeline you're in now is not the only one available. If something doesn't work out, you don't collapse. You recognize it as information. Maybe that outcome doesn't exist in the timeline you're selecting. Maybe a better one does. And instead of forcing what isn't aligning, you release and allow the field to guide you toward what is. This isn't passivity. It's trust. Trust that the reality you're vibrating at will deliver what matches it. And if what you wanted doesn't show up, it's because something better, something more aligned, is already on its way. Finally, living this way means you carry a quiet knowing. You don't need to convince anyone of what you understand. You don't need validation for the shifts you're making. You know what you know. And that knowing is enough. You move through life with a calm confidence that others might interpret as luck, as privilege, as ease. But you know it's none of those things. It's frequency. It's alignment. It's the result of consciously navigating the infinite library of realities and choosing, moment by moment, which book to read. You are not bound to one story. You are not trapped in one timeline. You are a consciousness with the ability to jump, to shift, to select. And you've been doing it unconsciously your entire life. But now you know. Now you see. And now that you see, you can never unsee. The question is no longer whether quantum jumping is real. The question is, now that you know you're doing it every day, which reality will you choose next?